There we go. Thank you. We began our very wild ride into parenthood at Seattle Reproductive Medicine. I was scheduled for an ultrasound to see if my body was able to ovulate. I remember looking at the screen and gleefully announcing that I had, in fact, ovulated. And the doctor said, well, actually, you're pregnant. So that is Owen's first picture there in the middle. At our 20-week ultrasound, we waited for what seemed like an eternity for our doctor to come in to talk to us. The maternal fetal medicine specialist shared with Ben and I that she saw something that was not quite textbook on Owen's brain. She said not to worry. She said, come back in a few weeks and that we will do another scan. At the time of our next ultrasound, the news went from potentially bad to confirmed worse. We were sent to have an amniocentesis test done, and then we began yet another wait. I couldn't help but think about this little baby that was in my belly and the secret that he had, and that it was about to be revealed. I felt the constant need to protect him, to reassure him that no matter what, I was going to love him and take care of him, that he was our little boy, and that is all that mattered. After another agonizing few weeks of waiting, I got the call. I was 27 weeks pregnant and standing in my cubicle at work. The genetics counselor had our test results. It wasn't any of the things that we had talked about. She said Owen had Crete-Shaw or 5p- syndrome. There was also a second issue. Owen had a microduplication on the Q arm of his 17th chromosome. There was virtually no information about this, as he was only the second known person to have this abnormality. What we did know was that with Crete-Shaw syndrome, or 5p-, it is a rare, severe pediatric neurodevelopmental disorder that is caused by a deletion of genes on the 5th chromosome. And the people with this syndrome typically require care for the rest of their lives. As our genetics counselor spoke, I could not feel my body. I was afraid that I was going to crumble into a puddle and that I would never again get up from the floor. Moments after that phone call, my amazing coworkers picked me up, they dried my tears, and they drove me home. And there I was yet again waiting, this time to break the news to Ben and our family. The weight of sharing Owen's secret felt heavy. I knew that this news was going to forever change all of our lives. Becoming a new parent no longer looked like baby showers and gift registries. It was finding a geneticist, a cardiologist, a neurologist, and learning about things like palliative care. All of this on top of being pregnant and trying to reassure others that we were going to be okay, even though I had no idea if that was the truth. Doctors told us that there was no cure, that there were no treatments, and possibly the worst part was that there wasn't even anyone looking to find one. And one of the many miracles that we have had on our journey, palliative care ranks amongst our favorite. Neither Ben nor I had ever heard of palliative care, but it was suggested to us that we reach out and try to get a consult, so we added it to the list of many appointments we had. As Ben, my sister Amy, and I waited to meet the palliative care team, who consisted of a palliative care doctor, social worker, and members of the delivery and neonatal intensive care unit at Mary Bridge Children's Hospital, our hope was just to understand what it might be like to give birth to a medically complex child. Owen's never quiet. He gets that from his mom. In that one conversation, Dr. David Brunel changed our lives. You see, becoming a parent puts you into a very large club, but finding out your child has a rare disease quickly removes you from that club and throws you onto an island all by yourself. Dr. Brunel was our lifeboat. He assured us that although the island wasn't what we pictured parenthood to look like, over time, we would make it our home, and that most importantly, we would not be alone. 4 days later, after that meeting at Mary Bridge, I had an emergency C-section at 34 weeks. You can see Owen's not only loud, but he packs a big crowd everywhere he goes. This was in the waiting room on September 29th, the day Owen Robert Schutz was born. For me, I remember I remember lying on the operating table and looking to my left. There was a medical team from the NICU working on Owen. Ben was by his side. There were no cries. I just watched and I waited for someone to look at me and tell me what was going on. Owen and Ben were then whisked away, leaving me alone in a room full of strangers, and I waited for hours to get to meet our son. During Owen's 103 days in the NICU, we laughed, we cried, I got shingles. Ben spent a lot of time on a very tiny couch, and Owen had a number of surgeries. While Owen fought to live, Ben and I had doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, social workers, and handfuls of other specialists teaching us terms and techniques that would be required to care for our son. Eventually, we came home as a family. Owen was on oxygen and monitors, he had a feeding tube, and we were given zero help outside of our family and our friends. The first year-ish, I would say, we were in complete survival mode. Our days were full of appointments. Typically, Owen would reflux, vomit, and stop breathing multiple times throughout the day, which resulted in me spending a great deal of time on the side of the road en route to Mary Bridge, suctioning him while he gagged in the car. Sleeping, that's funny, just kind of something we used to do. Slowly, we found our new normal. Ben and I began to yet again find joy. We had moments of calm, and we leaned on our medical providers and family to keep us going. However, there is also a grim reality of parenting a child with medical complexities. The reality is that we fight for absolutely everything. We watched the medical team that had been our lifeline demolished by administrators who didn't get it, and then we fought for 2 years to get them back. We had to fight to get Owen services that he qualified for at the state of Washington, and they refused to give them to us. We still fight. We fight for medical supplies, medications, therapies, and school accommodations. And each one of these fights requires hours of waiting. It is my hope that if we share our stories, our community will hear that the rare disease patients and caregivers are not okay. Owen is now 6.5 years old. He still requires 24/7 care, and we are lucky because we now have 2 incredible nurses and a caregiver that he loves, and they help us at home. And thanks to the Krita Shah Research Foundation, science is now interested in studying our child. Owen is full of joy. He loves to be with people. He plays Little League baseball and loves to ride his horse Boo at hippotherapy. It is safe to say the only milestone that Owen achieved early was the ability to roll his eyes at his embarrassing mother. And as for me, well, I'm gonna keep fighting and keep waiting for as long as I can to improve Owen's life. He has taught us that we are so much more than milestones and fitting in. On today, May 5th, which is Krita Shah Awareness Day, there is no better reminder of how lucky I am that I get the front row seat to watch Owen defy the odds all in his own time. Thank you.
Okay, now I would like to introduce you. Oh, thank you, Lindsay, so much, and Owen. I love her story. She's such a powerful speaker. Now I'd like to introduce a young advocate, Boston Newell, here. His mom has ataxia. I think young advocates have such a powerful and important voice. And I'm just so proud of Boston, because this is hard, and it takes a lot of courage to do this. So thank you for doing this, Boston. I'll let you introduce yourself more in the next moderator and section of the conference.
Hello, my name is Boston Newell. I am 10 years old and I am in 4th grade. I live in Bellingham, Washington with my dad, mom, and dog Obi-Wan. My mom has a rare disease, ataxia. She has difficulty with her balance and uses a cane to help her walk. Sometimes I worry about my mom, especially when she loses her balance. I love my family very much. Meet Joshua Henderson. Joshua started the Northwest Rare Disease Coalition to bring people together in Washington who are affected by rare diseases. They are the ones who organized today's conferences. But that's not all. Joshua is currently in charge of helping people with rare diseases at a company called Pulse InfoFrame. He works with doctors, patients, and companies from all over the world to collect important information that help these people get the treatments they need. Before working at Pulse InfoFrame, Joshua worked at a group called Springboard Enterprises. There he helped hundreds of entrepreneurs who were starting and growing their own healthcare and technology companies, many in the rare disease space. Please welcome Joshua, who will be moderating the next few panels this morning.
Hi, everyone. Boston, that was awesome. I will admit, I was hoping after we met at the reception last night that you might also mention I'm conversant in things like narwhals and unicorns and other sea creatures, but I'll add that to my online bio so we'll update that. So what we'll do in this section, I'm sort of MC for this next piece on investing in industry and biotech. What we're going to feature are presentations and discussions, bouncing back and forth, kind of highlighting where and when successful collaboration is done right. The challenges associated with bringing treatments from the lab and that early research that we saw earlier today, bringing it all the way through to the patient. And I think for us at the coalition, what we're about are events like this and bringing together people and trying to come up with solutions, whether that's addressing it through policy, addressing it through collaboration, addressing it through education. And I often feel like sort of this like challenge hunter or like excavator. And it can feel sometimes like, hey, we're focusing on the negative. Like, what are all the things that are wrong? Where are all the challenges? Where are all the gaps? And you'll hear a lot about that over the next few sessions. But it's because we're trying to figure out what are the solutions and what are the best policy levers that we can pull to have a big impact. What are the ways that we can organize events like this, workshops, going to Olympia, whatever we need to do to figure out solutions. So it's challenges and really understanding the challenges, because oftentimes, I mean, for me, like working with Max and the team, like I wasn't in policy before this, and I didn't realize that oftentimes, the first step is only the first step of a multi-step journey. So once you get sort of coverage for genome sequencing, like then it opens up this whole, we've got a panel later, which we've said would take hours, but we've only got 45 minutes to cover all gaps and challenges related to genetic testing. So really what we're about are solutions. And so as you hear these talks, and if you feel sort of motivated to get engaged at the Northwest Rare Disease Coalition, we'd love to take the energy from today and continue to work with you, engage you on our task forces, which you'll hear about this afternoon. So 2 goals today, really. One is around socializing kind of the importance of bringing all the players to the table, bringing industry, patients, researchers, bringing everyone's welcome in the coalition. And I think the second piece is, again, looking at ways that we can take the insights from the experts you'll hear and work with the community to come up with policy change and solutions. So with this, we're going to invite up Wendy Erler. You've got a buddy over there now. She's welcome to come up too. We'll have you up first, Holly Snyder, Emily Radamiel, representing pharma and biotech of different sizes. I think sometimes there's this perception that industry is at odds with the patient, but we hope that when you hear from them and hear about all the programs they're running, the impact that those programs have had in the lives of patients, and when you get groups like these three who really work to elevate the patient voice in the diagnostic process and in the drug development process, you can see the magic of that collaboration in action. So with that, Wendy, we'll invite you up.
Thank you. Boston, great job. Last night he said he was nervous. I don't know where those nerves went because they weren't here today, so good job. This is my favorite forum when we have researchers and industry and caregivers and patients, and we're all here driven by the same purpose, so it truly is my honor to be here. I lead patient advocacy at Alexion, which is a rare disease company. We're part of AstraZeneca, which is a very large pharmaceutical company doing incredible work in areas such as oncology and respiratory. But we have a distinct focus in Alexion on rare diseases, and within that we have a focus on rare neurology. So it was really important to me to be here in person. I wanted to talk just very briefly about sort of what expertise we're building within Alexion, but most importantly, why that matters to all of you. We built a capability within our company focused on patient centricity and patient advocacy. That sounds like words on a wall. So what's different and special about what we do? We intentionally hired a team of experts to be able to listen to the patient voice, bring it into our organization at a leadership level where they can hold all decision makers accountable for actually doing something with the insights we hear. It sounds simple, it's not. And I think Josh used the word challenges. We see those as opportunities, but you can't really deliver on this commitment if you don't have the organization to do so. The way I talk about it to kind of bring it home for everybody is we have regulatory experts, we have medical experts, we have compliance experts, we have marketing experts. If we don't have people who have a deep commitment to being patient experts, we're not really going to be able to do this work in the right way. So we've built that at Alexion. We think about it as storyboarding the patient journey. So what really happens, and the stories this morning are so powerful, how do we pull that through and drive change together? We have built a number of frameworks. I wanted to focus specifically on what we call the patient friction coefficient. So what does that mean? We took little discrete parts of all the experiences you all have to fully map out and storyboard this patient experience, understand how that experience and everyone moves through this journey over the course of time, often with multiple family members involved. And what are those right places where we can and should intervene? It's not everywhere. We're all in this together, right? But where should we be making things better? And then how do we create world-class capabilities and mindset to improve the ecosystem? One of those ways is this patient friction coefficient. And the acronym is PFC. What that really means is one of the pieces of work that we do is accelerate and amplify rare disease clinical trials. For many of you, that can be the first point of meaningful entry to the healthcare system for a specific condition. So not that you're not accessing healthcare for everything else, but specifically to look at a potential treatment or supportive care for a condition is a clinical trial. We developed a framework within rare disease for patient friction coefficient to actually assess the burden of participating in that clinical trial. So how do we make it easier for all of you to participate, contribute data, deliver on research without it being 10 times more burdensome than your lives already are? And we do this by really meaningfully having patient engagement. So this is a little different from input to a protocol. What does that scientific protocol actually look like? It's specific to the experience within the clinical trial, and we bring in patients and patient advocacy groups to help address this. So I'll give an example. If we're enrolling in a study and we're including people who are ages 12 to 65, a 14-year-old is going to have a very different experience no matter what's going on with the condition or the social justice issues or anything else than a 60-year-old in that same study or a 45-year-old. So oversimplifying, but how do we really address that burden for everybody so we can make a trial that's more accessible for all in a way that makes it easier for families to participate and contribute? This work actually came about because I was working with an advocate in Huntington's disease. And if you don't know about Huntington's disease, it's a genetic neurological condition that if you carry the gene, it's fully penetrant, so you will get the disease. And this woman has 3 children and her husband who are potentially, her husband is affected and the children are potentially affected. They've been in 12 clinical trials as a family. And she talked about it's not the day of the visit. We finally get to the hospital, we can get through that day. It's the 3 days leading up to leaving for that visit, because when you have a neurological condition, routine, consistency, plan is a key to success. A clinical trial visit throws that all off. And then it's the 3 days after, coming back home, the re-entry, getting back into that routine. And her message to us was, you're asking us for 6 or 7 days a month, not that one clinical trial visit you're focused on. Our PFC work aims to answer some of that. So we designed and implemented patient friction coefficient. We also really look at an analysis of patient advocacy groups within our different disease state areas, as well as broader what we call umbrella groups, so Global Genes, Child Neurology Foundation, et cetera. Where are your priorities as a patient advocacy group? Where should we collaborate? We don't want to just come to you with our imperatives and we need information on X. We want to partner. And then we built process and governance. So patient friction coefficient requires a lot of process and governance. We have to have consent forms. We have to have NDAs. We have to have all these things in place so that we can proactively share what could be considered confidential data with the patient communities who are the experts. So I just wanted to give a little snippet to, there are many, many ways to work with industry. My advice and ask of everybody from the patient community is trust yourselves. You truly are the experts. We often work within teams within industry that everyone's got a lot of advanced degrees and a lot of brilliance and a lot of scientific expertise. Patient verbatims are the most important scientific data we have, and your experience is unique and critical. Come to the table as an expert. Demand us that we listen and that we, change the way that we work, because truly that's the only way we're going to find meaningful, successful conclusions for everybody. So thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of the session.
Thank you, Wendy. And Holly Snyder from Illumina next. And as Wendy mentioned, we will have time after these 3 speakers for some questions.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Carolina, and to the organization for including us in today's presentation. So a lot of what Wendy just described is very similar for us at Illumina. But I thought I would start out with kind of who Illumina is. I'm a genetic counselor by training, and I've been with Illumina for about 10 and a half years. And I thought as a genetic counselor, I understood advocacy, and still until we brought on an advocacy manager, and I really began to understand the importance of the relationship with advocacy groups. And I learned a lot from that individual. So we are, at our roots, a sequencing company. Illumina started off with building genetic testing equipment to sequence exomes, genomes, but we became kind of a clinical company around the time that I joined, so about 10 or 11 years ago. And these are all of the clinical areas that we focus in, and then research areas as well. So primarily on our medical affairs team, we're focused on reproductive health, oncology, genetic disease testing, and infectious disease, which with COVID has become an even bigger concern. But in the genetic disease testing segment, we work specifically with implementation of genetic testing, mostly exome or genome sequencing for rare disease, mostly in pediatrics, but we're sort of recognizing the importance of bringing this into the adult segment. And we have patient advocacy work or an advocacy support for oncology, reproductive health, and genetic disease testing. There's a shared agreement between Illumina and the patients and the advocacy groups that we work with. This is strictly done through the medical organization, where our public affairs, patient advocacy, and medical affairs teams are the ones that really take the responsibility for the relationship. We try very hard to respect the point of view and the stories from our patients. Mostly we're dealing with parents in this setting. And so the advocacy vision is really to work to understand and translate the experience of the families for rare disease, and see how our mission and their mission align, and how we can further support their efforts to finding diagnoses for rare disease. And so we do this through supporting their individual and collective goals, and I'll give you some examples of how we do that in a moment. We try to take the voice of the patient or the parent and see how we can help promote education through that. And one, I think, pretty cool thing that we do is we bring in some of these parents or patients into internal meetings. Because if you think about the people working in research and development, they really need a face. They really need to understand what is at the end result of their work that they're doing in research. And when we have this happen, these auditoriums kind of fill up, or Zoom meetings, you see people crying and very emotional. And that helps to drive what some of these individuals do. And then we work to build bridges. So while we're not directly developing treatments, there are opportunities for us to work with some of these organizations that are developing treatments to help identify those patients that would benefit. So here's a few examples. And this is not the updated slide, but here's a few examples of some of the things that we work on. So Child Neurology Foundation, which Wendy mentioned, we're also a corporate advisory board member for CNF. And we were just having a random conversation with their CEO a few years ago and said, how cool would it be to just give away some free genomes to patients that are part of the CNF network? And we laughed, and then we thought maybe we actually could do that, but do it in a way that creates some meaningful results. So we supported a small project where 25 patients, all under the age of 16, had access to a genome. And as the industry partner, we were hands off with this. We said, you figure out what makes the most sense and how you get these patients referred. They work with their physician network, identified patients. They determined which ones they wanted to submit. And then our lab, and Katie was part of that, who you'll hear from a little bit later, sequenced the patients, and we were able to identify 6 out of 25 confirmed cases, and then a few extra cases where there's a VUS that is very likely to be related to the underlying etiology. And then we've presented that, and now it's been written up as a manuscript. And so it was just a really great way to highlight how industry and advocacy can work together. We give presentations to different organizations. I just presented at SLC 6A1 Connect. I don't know if anybody in the room knows Amber Freed, who's the CEO of that organization, but we've had her come in and speak. She's had us come speak at her events. And so it's this mutual partnership that we have is with our aligned messaging. We work on policy change. And so there are different efforts across the US for state funding for either research or direct Medicaid support for rapid genomes in a NICU-PICU setting. And I know in Washington, there's some pretty awesome things going on here. But we try to help identify patients that could help support some of those efforts. And then we help create other opportunities through education, like with Global Genes. We're doing something with the CNV Commission, which is research-based. And then Ring 20 support, which again is also, they're doing some research. I think it's a project called Unraveled that we are providing support to. And again, it's mostly funding, but in that case, we're helping to provide the genomes to that research. And then there's a video here. I don't know if anyone's seen this video called The Journey of Hope. It's won a lot of awards. I think it's now 2 years old, maybe 18 years old. 2020 Film Festival, so wow, 3 years old. Time has flown by. But this was something where we provided funding to support, but then we've taken it a step further and really helped them to get this video out there into the community, not just in the UK, but globally. So we're I think helping more to amplify the patient's voice. We have had families come in to our network where we've said, oh, we think that you could really provide value over here to this completely unrelated, to Illumina thing that's going on, and brought those individuals together. Danny Miller, who some of you may know, he has two little boys with ME-PAN syndrome. He's been part of our network, and it was so exciting to see that he was an author on the ACMG evidence-based guideline. And we had nothing to do with that. It's just we're trying to find these individuals where we know they're making real impact as one person or as one organization, and trying to help those individuals amplify their message as best as we can. They are not being asked to promote Illumina sequencing. They're not being asked to promote one test in particular. We're helping them to show why a diagnosis is important, why it matters. The last thing I'll mention, actually two more things. This Rare Youth Revolution, I don't know much about this, but our patient advocacy manager asked me to throw this in. I believe this is a fairly new event that's being held, and I think it's in July in, I want to say Chapel Hill, so maybe the Research Triangle area. And this is a way to bring youth together. And so Illumina is sponsoring this, but I just wanted to put it out there in case you're not aware of it. I think they have plans to do some pretty great things with workshops for youth to maybe learn, job skills, writing a resume, interview skills. So finding ways to bring these individuals together. And again, it's just us learning about these groups and seeing how we can help to amplify their message. There are always opportunities at Illumina, or I should say, there's always interest within Illumina. We have a lot of genetics geeks at Illumina who want to do research. We want to, help companies like Enlorum or other drug companies find those patients who will benefit from a treatment, and therefore, through exome or genome sequencing can help make that connection. So if there's ever an opportunity and you think, this could be something really great, we just need a partner in the diagnostic setting. That's where I think we can provide a lot of value. That said, we're also resource limited, like many organizations are. But that's really how, I think, highlighting how we work best with patients and advocacy groups is partnerships to drive your mission forward through diagnostic testing. So with that.
Thank you, Holly. Next up, Emily from Mazi Therapeutics. As you're coming up, I do want to mention and just give a shout out to Yael Weiss, who's the CEO of Mazi Therapeutics. Some of you know, formerly of Ultragenics. She's the reason why Carolina and I know each other when I first moved to Washington. She introduced us, and actually Ultragenics and Yael are the reason why I was introduced to the rare disease space at all. So with that, grateful to Mazi and Emily.
Thank you. I am no Yael Weiss. She is a rock star. She is a genius. I'm a sub today, so bear with me. I wanted to introduce Mazi Therapeutics to you. I can do it. I got it. Okay. Mazi, we're actually fairly new. So compared to Alexion and Illumina, we've actually only been around since 2021, late 2021. And founded by Yael, we're a group of 8 people who are absolutely passionate and driven by rare disease drug development. One of us is a rare disease mom and a fierce patient advocate. That's Allison Barrett. She is on the board of the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics. 2 of us are aunts. Myself and Jennifer Panicoulias are both aunts of children who have rare, actually they're both adults now, who have rare genetic neurodevelopmental diseases. So Mazi was founded based on the idea of togetherness. Mazi is a Greek word. I don't think any of us are Greek. Romney, are you Greek? No Greek, can you? I don't think anyone in our company is Greek, but we're founded on a Greek word for together. And it really reflects the strategy of partnering early with the community to focus on how we're going to bring these treatments to fruition. So right at the top of the circle, you'll see patient and family groups, and that's at the heart of our mission. We work with patient and family groups right from the very beginning, and I'll show you an example of what we're doing on the next slide. So we're working closely with the Walks Foundation, with the Pitt Hopkins Research Foundation, and also the Coalition to Cure CHD2 currently, and there are always more in the works. We work with these groups really, I think, first and foremost to learn about the disease. There is a lot of listening going on in right now as we're growing our company and becoming a company. And part of what we're doing right now is really listening, learning. We also work with diagnostic companies like GeneDx and others to help diagnose patients. We work with academia. We work with the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and that's Dr. Akulon, who's you heard early this morning talk about. You did a little talk about walks, and also University of Oxford. I'm going to go to the next slide. So short and sweet, providing just a few examples of what we've done so far, and there is a lot more to come. But right now we're sponsoring free genetic testing through a company called Probably Genetic. And this is really a patient caregiver centric website that parents can go on, and they include what symptoms they're seeing. And then based on that, Probably Genetic sends out a diagnostic kit. And we are sponsoring that, so sponsoring free testing right now. We also, one success, we were able to get both WOX and TCF4 genes into a study that's called the Guardian Study. It's being funded in New York and run in New York City. And basically what they're doing is moving forward, all newborns in New York City will be screened for a whole host of genetic mutations, and we just got WOX and TCF4 genes on there, so we're very excited about that. Other things we're doing, so patient and caregiver experience is obviously fundamental, so we're participating in patient and family meetings. We've also conducted and are conducting surveys and interviews with patients and parents to understand, one, the diagnostic journey, the disease experience, caregiver burden, and existing need and support systems. And we've heard this multiple times in different presentations. And I think what is important here is that we're aiming to develop meaningful clinical outcome measures. If it's not meaningful to you, if it's not meaningful to the family, then really what's the point? So we want our studies and our focus to be on outcomes that are going to be meaningful for the family. In the coming months, we are developing our phase 1/2 clinical study, which will hopefully start in the coming year. But we'll be kicking off a patient and caregiver advisory board. And I really liked, where's Wendy? I don't see Wendy anymore, but I really liked the PFC. And I don't know if you've trademarked that, but I love it. Okay, I absolutely love it. So we are setting up a few meetings with, I've got 5 minutes, I'm getting the hook. Setting up a few meetings with our patient and caregiver groups to show them the protocol, show them what we're thinking of putting in there, and then understanding, is this important to you? Are the things that we've included in here important to you? Are they meaningful? But also, is this study practical? Can you actually do the things? I think you'd mentioned, 6 days between before you come in for the clinic visit and after, totally can disrupt your life. So is this practical? And then finally, what support do you need in order to participate? And then, obviously we design our study from there. So we're early days, but we are, now I think we're 10 people. We're passionate. We really are fundamentally, it's the patient voice that matters to us. And just on a personal note, I just think it's phenomenal. I think moms, and sorry dads, I know there are dads out there, but I say this a lot, moms are changing the way that we do drug development, and I just think it's just phenomenal, and I love you guys. So thank you, that's all I have.
Testing, testing. So I'd like to invite the panelists to come back up, and Emily, you can come over here as well. Just want to thank you all for sharing, your stories and your programs that you have at your organizations. I think, we often talk to, parents and advocacy groups around, hey, one is know that there are these resources at biopharma companies, many biopharma companies, available to you. I think that's one thing. The second, I think, Carolina, you mentioned earlier, in any industry, there are, bad collaborators and good collaborators, and these are some of the good ones. I have a couple questions. I'm gonna open it up to the audience for questions in a minute, but I wanted to ask first, Wendy, I loved how you said, kind of be bold, demand our attention. You all have sort of pipelines and growing pipelines and disease areas that you focus on and specialize in. I think for patients and families who are affected by those diseases, it's great that they can come to one of you. If they don't, if it's a different disease, what can they do? Can they still engage with you, and how, and what does that look like?
So the short answer is yes, and I think one of the things we see with, and I'll say moms and dads, is that we're in a people business, and we're in a connections business. So definitely reach out to us. I had a family reach out to me. They were from Panama, and their little girl has a rare collagen 6 disorder. And she reached out to Alexion, somehow through beautiful channels got connected to me. And I took the call, and she proceeded, after we got to know each other, to tell me she'd reached out to 14 companies and 13 had not taken her call. And we do not have a program in collagen 6, but that does not matter. And this isn't about me, but because we are in rare disease, I was able to connect her to people that could actually help her, and one of whom was Tim Yu at Boston Children's and several others. And I've since gotten to know her family, and I've had the opportunity to spend time with them. So get to the right person, to your point. And whether they're good or bad collaborators, it's a people business. So get to the right person, keep trying. And I think it's important whether there's a pipeline product or not, because pipelines change. Areas of focus change, leadership changes, research imperatives change. You never know.
I love that point too about, that there are researchers that you may be working with in other specialties, and they have colleagues at Boston Children's or others. And so, and also we heard earlier that, there are Overgrowth Syndrome Alliance, there are overlapping interests from a biological perspective, from a relationship perspective. So that's great. Thank you for that. Any questions from the audience that we have? Oh.
Thanks. All right, so my question is looking for a recommendation. When trying to do fundraising, is it better to kind of saddle up to some of the bigger groups where it gets divvied up amongst many? I guess, with my son's rare disease, we can fundraise for our Krita Shah Research Foundation, which is great. But I guess, where are we going to get the most bang for our buck, or what would you all recommend we do in that front?
I'm going to jump in, and then I'll turn it over. Two things. I think it's really important to reinforce over and over that you're a nonprofit organization, and that's why fundraising is critical. So, because there's language internally with industry that really directs where funding can go from a compliance perspective. So happy to have any conversations offline on that. But I also think it's really critical to understand what organizations like yours have done to drive research, meaning natural history study, registry. What do those things look like? But not just, we have a natural history study, or, we have a registry. What are you collecting? In what countries? How valid is the data? Because then that helps us not have redundancy. So we really want to know what's already been done. And that's another area where bring that expertise to the table, and then say to us, what are you going to do with this? What are your research asking? We tend, I say in the industry, we do a lot of navel gazing. So we think we know everything, and we think we're the experts. Force our hand on that, because we're not.
I think too, there's considerations around, who you're talking to and what group it is within pharma, and if it's support through fundraising of things like real-world data, registries, or is it a different sort of pocket and area of the organization that might be willing to support an annual conference or a research-focused, event? Kind of different ways depending on where within the universe of the organization that you're talking to. Up there, and then we can.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm a genetic counselor with Illumina. It struck me as we were talking about kind of this request for parents who are caregivers to children of rare disease or children who have rare disease that it really shouldn't require that. So we're saying that, it requires someone to be the squeaky wheel, right? And to have time on their hands to call 16 companies and have the, kind of education and awareness of the landscape of pharmaceuticals to even know who to call or even begin researching that. It requires money to, give that time. And it just feels like that's so much to put on families. And for every family that gets through to talk to someone in a company, there are thousands of families that aren't doing that. And so I try to be careful about putting so much onus on families, but in the current landscape, that is necessary. So my question is, what are you seeing in your own organizations that makes you optimistic for the future that maybe we won't have to rely so much on individual families?
I don't know if it's working. Okay. I couldn't agree with you more. I actually have a very personal experience with that exactly. My sister, who is a nurse by training, has a daughter, Georgia, who's 20 going on 22, and has an undiagnosed but very clearly to us and her doctors genetic disorder. And my sister at a certain point just said, well, this was in 2004, had testing, didn't find anything, and just said, well, I don't really know what to do. And so she's a perfect example of somebody that wouldn't be doing that outreach. And I actually had to force her to say, Anne, go into probably genetics. Enter her, it's changing times, let's do this. And you're right, we do see that it's typically the more educated parents. So, our chief development officer is a veterinarian by training. She absolutely is a tiger, and she she knew how to look at the research papers and contact those people. And so I'm just validating what you're saying, is that it is really, really hard. I think one piece of hope that I see is that there are so many new patient groups starting. There's a trend in people are seeing that it's possible, and the more patient groups like these that start, the more people will see it, the more accessible it will become. And so I think the Ultragenics Bootcamp is a really great example of that as well.
But I just had an aha, which is why we all need to do this and come together in person. What if we come together and build sort of that, what is the roadmap to working with contact? How do you read a research paper? Where do you get the email addresses for all those doctors that are listed in the subject line? And maybe we could put together a couple of, workshops or useful pieces of information. Someone on my team developed a Drug Development 101 program, and she literally educates people on the drug development process beyond this is the definition of a phase 1 trial, really that continuum of, and why we just had the tragic news we had to share with the community last week that one of our trials failed. And I spent every night on the phone with people in that study telling me this drug is saving their lives. The data do not bear that out. The experience is different. But maybe we take that on and work with you, Carolina, and Effie, and all of you rock star people, and really pull together so that those parents who do have to advocate and do a lot of this legwork have a roadmap.
Great, love that. Solutions. We had a question down here.
Hi, I have a specific question for Holly. My name is Jill. I have 2 kids affected by a newly discovered ultra-rare, an ultra-rare disease.
So you won the jackpot.
Yeah. It's actually still a VUS because there's only one paper published about it. We're waiting on the second. So at Illumina, when you do sequencing, do you allow patient advocacy groups to like provide a letter or anything that you could send to the clinicians or to the families? I'm thinking particularly on a VUS where they can know, no, this actually is significant. We just don't have the enough evidence yet.
Yeah, I mean, VUSs are definitely, I think, a source of contention for a lot of patients and families. Katie maybe can comment on this because she works directly in the lab, but I think, you know, following the variant classification guidelines is how our lab functions. And so it's, you know, there is a subjectivity to reporting variants, but there's also the classification guidelines that are out there, and they're updating those guidelines to help with the VUS piece specifically, instead of just being a VUS kind of where there's going to be a continuum for VUSs, which maybe will make everyone's life even more insane. I don't know how some of the other labs are doing it, but I think it's a good point. Like, could a patient advocacy group provide a letter? But ultimately, at the end of the day, I believe it's the clinician seeing the patient. The onus is on them to say, based on the phenotype, based on what the lab provides us in data that's available, this, you know, it is our professional decision or professional opinion and that this is significant or pathogenic. And so, you know, we can only do so much as a lab within the guidelines.
So just FYI, like GeneDx has a template that they had me fill out that they will give to the clinician about our VUS that says, here's a patient organization if you're looking for more information about this. So I'd love it if Illumina would do something like that as well.
We don't do, most of the clinical genomes that we do are part of research studies. So we're not this, like GeneDx is really, you know, doing the, like, you know, GeneDx, PerkinElmer, there are other labs doing it, you know, Rady Children's. So most of our genomes are part of various research projects.
Got it. And then my question for everybody is, do you have suggestions on underserved populations? Like, we have a founder gene in Latin America populations, consanguineous families. So are there initiatives in this? What do you suggest if we're likely to find more patients in these populations?
I'm gonna let you answer that because you're the biggest company.
So there is no simple answer. Let's all just be honest here. And years ago, I was working on a really exciting clinical trial in Huntington's disease, and there's a significant patient population in Venezuela, and the therapy under research was intrathecal, and we had this amazing commitment to build an intrathecal clinic and study this drug in Venezuela where all these patients are. And one of the principal scientists in Venezuela stopped me in my tracks and said, these people need toilet paper. And it was such a wake-up call for me because we had run down this road thinking we're so patient-centric and this is such a cool initiative. And he was like, yeah, you want to put an injection in their spine, they need toilet paper. So I think it's really understanding what are the needs of these communities, that at some point, someday in the future, a cure would be fantastic, but what do we need to do between now and then? And that's where it really takes partnership with the patient advocacy organizations. The other hard part about clinical research is to get that done as fast as possible, which is still not anywhere near fast enough. You really have to study in areas where you can contribute the patients quickly and do the enrollment. That may not include these underserved populations, but if in the surround sound of the work you're doing, you can make sure that everybody knows these patients are there, and when it comes time to access, that those drugs are available. So it's very complex. We have a significant social justice and health equity initiative trying to address some of this, but it's different in every rare disease community.
So unfortunately, I know I saw your hand. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Would love to keep going with you all, but thank you so much. Hopefully, during the next break, we can catch you for follow-up questions. But please, thank you. So for our next conversation, I'll invite up Julie Haber-Boyd from Ultragenics, and Marianne Hamilton Lopez from Duke's Health Policy Center. We're going to talk about policy levers around accelerating access to care and research. Julie's going to go first. We're gonna focus on sort of high level around a variety of different policy opportunities in the landscape of research, some of which we are focused on at the coalition, so we'll dig into later. And then with Marianne, we'll bring up and focus around sort of evidence generation and other considerations. So, Julie.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I think it's still morning. I'm Julie Boyd, and I'm part of the government affairs team at Ultragenics. I cover the western part of the country, so we're not in every state, but that's my focus. I have a counterpart on the east, and then I cover the west. So a little bit about my background. Prior to coming into this role, I served as the policy director for the Texas Healthcare and Bioscience Institute, which is essentially Texas Bio. So, and then before that, I worked in the House and the Senate at the Texas state level. So, worked on healthcare issues and then the healthcare portion of the budget. So, a little bit about Ultragenics. So we were founded in 2010, and we currently have 4 approved therapies for 5 different conditions. To date, we've treated roughly 3,200 patients globally, and we have currently have 7 clinical trial programs and 5 in pivotal studies. So the title of this panel talks about policy levers, and policy is my background primarily, so that's really what I'm going to kind of focus on. But before I talk about policy levers, which are basically tools to kind of direct or manage and shape changes in public policy, I want to talk about or lay out some principles or a framework that I feel like need to be considered when you're looking at policies for rare patients and families. So the first thing is that rare disease is a significant public health issue. So we all know the numbers, 1 in 10. And you know, it's something that really needs to be considered at a policy level. Also, healthcare and treatment for these diseases is a human rights issue. So, you know, it's basically access to healthcare requires specific policies to be put in place that everybody should be entitled to. The third thing is that a comprehensive approach to rare disease is needed. So this includes education, prevention, diagnosis, care and treatment, social supports, and then both basic and clinical research. The fourth thing is that patient groups obviously play a very critical role in the development of knowledge about these diseases, and they should be included at all levels in the development of policies and services. Last but probably the most important is hope. So each therapeutic success story provides new technologies, new approaches, new insights that can be applied across the entire rare community. So I'm going to talk about 2 different buckets, access and then research. Access and then policies that I feel like states can be doing at a local level to promote rare disease policies. So the first thing that I want to talk about, and I won't cover these because I know there's sessions in the afternoon where these are going to be covered in more depth, but you can't have the discussion about access without the newborn screening. These state programs are critical, and it's really about, obtaining an early and accurate diagnosis and allowing patients to seek effective treatments sooner. Strengthening these programs, promoting them, and this is where, we can drive impactful change at the state level. And then the second policy is genetic testing. And I know that's been discussed at a certain level already. So, and then the third are rare disease advisory councils. So these are entities that I think there's about 25 states that have passed these bills, but this really gives patients and families a voice at the legislative level. Sometimes legislators, they get put on these different health committees, and they have the ability to make decisions that affect patients and families. And so it's critical, for them to have the education and the understanding about, what it is to be a rare disease patient, what it is to be a caregiver, what is most important, what are challenges, what are barriers. So, and then, so switching to research, the way that we support the rare disease community, is by helping obtain early and accurate diagnosis, whether it's a disease that a particular company is studying or, it doesn't have to be that, because we're here trying to help move the field forward by sharing our science and our expertise to help advance future development. Examples of this can be, sharing data as well as endpoints to both physician groups and patient groups. Our Rare Boot Camp was mentioned earlier. That's something that we're very proud of. And this is really designed for patients and advocates who have started funding rare disease research and are looking to kind of better coordinate or structure what those efforts are going to be kind of moving forward. So that's something that we're very proud of. So in conclusion, I think it's obvious from a policy perspective, we're all here to expand and improve the quality of life for rare patients. And it's about the collaboration. It's about bringing all of the appropriate people to the table. And because that's really how we're gonna affect and make change happen. So just making sure I covered everything. So I think now I'll turn it over to Dr. Hamilton Lopez, and she's gonna share some insights on the economics around things. So thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And yes, I wanted to just mention, as you come up, that this will sort of start a theme of the next few talks using cell and gene therapy as a lens. Now, not all rare diseases are genetic. Not all modalities to treat those rare diseases are cell or gene therapies. But we think it's a good theme to kind of bring up a lot of the challenges around, high cost, access, evidence generation to support those therapies. So those are some of the points you'll touch on here, and then also some of our talks later. Thanks.
All right. Nice to meet you all. Marianne, as mentioned, I'm part of Duke University. We have a Duke Margolis Policy Center focused on health and health policy research. I'm based in DC, and Julie and I were asked really to come and talk about what are some of the ways that different stakeholders need to be at the table. And I've heard a lot today about the realms around clinical development and how we need patient voices. And so, we're going to continue that, but with a little bit looking at once we have some therapies that start to come to market, how can we make sure that there's still then the environment that allows for access? So what I do is, in my role is, I oversee biomedical innovation, which really means nothing because I'm from DC and we just like fancy titles there. But what my teams look at is everything to do with medical products. How can we do clinical trials differently? We do a lot of work with FDA. What are they looking for? How do they make their decisions? What happens when you don't have these kind of standard clinical trials and for the kinds of rare diseases we're talking about today? And then, what is the potential of real world evidence and who owns that and who collects it and who uses it? And then at the other end of that, how do we pay for this? And how are prices made? And CMS makes coverage decisions. How does that happen? And so all that my work is trying to understand what are the policies that enable the development and then the use and access of therapeutics for patients that need them. So I know there's going to be a whole bit of panels on policy. I won't get too much into it. And also on cell and gene. I'm not going to get into the science of it. I'm here more as a policy nerd to say to you that this is kind of the environment that I live in right now. And to say that, you all who are living in the trenches, who are seeing the type of daily struggles of trying to get people to pay attention, that is a lot of the work that is not always heard necessarily from the people who are making decisions. And so I think there's been some really good points that were made throughout the morning about, how do you make sure that you're at the table? And, I can kind of show you kind of the general feel of things that we hear in kind of on the national lens. One, we know that there's a lot of clinical trials going on. And, obviously in oncology, and that there's cell and gene therapies on the horizon. There's a lot also an acceleration of approvals at FDA. And I can also tell you that all of this is political. There's a lot of discussions right now in Washington about what accelerated approvals mean and should they be allowed and what is the evidence. So that's always kind of in the background of the work that's being done. Nevertheless, we're seeing a lot of movement. For those of you who actually live this life and maybe there doesn't feel like it's moving fast enough, for kind of the world that's trying to make policy decisions around it, it seems like it's coming and no one really knows quite what to do about it. And I say that usually just to be really honest, that there's in the way that we kind of think about pain and drugs and therapies, it's really transactional. We have a business model where a pharmaceutical company may get payment for the kind of the more usage of a drug. You're the insurance company, you're the manufacturer. I make it, it's used, I pay you. That's it. If I use more of it, I get paid more. And that's kind of what's been our model. It doesn't really work so well in the rare disease community, where we're not going to be seeing the markets where you're having big volume. And it's not necessarily going to work so much when we're talking about this pipeline of cell and gene therapies. So there's a lot of uncertainty, if I'm being honest, a lot of confusion about what that means, how we're going to pay for it, how will it be regulated, how do you know it works? And I think that just to kind of give you a sense of what we hear, because we work with a lot of different stakeholders, the main things, and I thought there was a really good presentation from one of the genetic counselors earlier about kind of the role of evidence and what are health outcomes that matter. That's a lot of what we hear about, because there's a lot of budgetary impacts for high upfront costs. That's my way of saying these drugs are expensive, and they're coming to market with really big price tags. Now, on the other end, these potentially have some new impacts for those of us who are really hopeful about them. They might see some durable impacts. I'm not allowed to say curative because I've been told not to ever say that, but then curative approaches. So, I mean, if you're looking at it from a financial perspective, you could say, sure, this might cost $1 million for a one-time administration, but if this person had to continue on a chronic pill, they'd be paying even more than that over the lifespan. So that makes sense from in theory. As a system, we are not set up for that. And we are all kind of trying to get our heads around, how do you pay for things that are going to have maybe impacts years down the road? How do you build those contracts to better understand if the outcomes are still there 5 or 10 years down the road? If I'm a health insurance company and you want me to pay my $1 million up front, and then the patient says, well, thank you, I am cured. I feel great. I'm going to go move to Washington and start an organic farm, and I'm going to leave my health insurance. That's the only thing I could think of what people do here in Washington. But it's the insurance company is then left with, I put this money in, and now you're gone. And that is the unfortunate components of having a fragmented healthcare system. So that is in part what we're seeing when we have this hope, like this biomedical innovation that for patients and doctors and, is kind of like the future is here. There's been no cure. We have hope for the first time. For those who are then looking at the price tags, they say, we want that too, but how are we going to pay for that up front when we are not set up to do these kinds of contracts? And when I say insurance companies, it's really, we all know our big bad insurance companies in our head, believe me, but I'm also talking about your state Medicaids and those Medicaid companies that have to, Medicaid agencies that have to do budgets on an annual or biannual basis. And they say to those of us who are researching this, I want to cover for my population. Does that mean I have to take away from roads or education programs? Whether or not that really will play out, we don't know, but that's what people are starting to see when they kind of see what's on the horizon of our innovation versus the reality of payment. There's a lot of uncertainty too. For a lot of patients and parents, they say, we just want to do it. Let us try. We've had nothing. For a lot of people who are making the payment decisions, they're saying, you're telling us you're going to cure this. How do I know? You're coming from a clinical trial with just a few hundreds of people in it. You got through FDA approval. But how do I know? How do I know that I'm going to put this $1 million in now? It's going to work 5 years down the road. And we don't have the real world evidence infrastructure yet to say, we know because we have followed these people. So that's kind of the uncertainty that we're playing with as we're trying to think through how do we have these conversations from a multi-stakeholder perspective that balances concerns about payment, a financial system that does not do well with just upfront payments over long term, but also a very strong sense of hope and need from the patient community. And so I think that's really where we can have multi-stakeholder discussions at a national level. I don't think the decision should be made from policymakers necessarily that might not understand all these complexities, and that it needs to be manufacturers at that table, insurance companies at that table, health systems at that table who, they themselves are going to have specialized administration and the like for all of these therapies. But most importantly, patients at the table who can say, we know that there's complexities. We understand that some of it is administrative, some of them is just systematic, but that doesn't mean that the conversation should stop here, that we should, carve out and not pay for things, or that, we should stop researching. It should be, we understand these complexities And we're all committed to figure out how we can think creatively about how to move forward for this new future of therapies on the horizon. So with that, I thank you for the invitation to be here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
So I'll invite the two of you up, and we'll go ahead and do some questions. So I'll open it up to questions in 1 minute. I just want to ask, kind of building on Katie's theme or question in the last section around reasons to be optimistic. So you talked about a lot of challenges around, especially when we get into things like high cost to develop drugs, high cost to receive treatments. What are your reasons to be optimistic? What are you seeing?
Is it on?
Is it working? I am optimistic because the conversations and the conversations are happening, and two, because there are a lot of different entities who want this to work. I think that at Duke, we have a consortium which is multi-stakeholder, and it's trying to be in a pre-competitive space, and it's payers and CMS is there, and manufacturers, many of them who are competitors, they come to the table because they want to see that this is coming. This is our horizon, we hope, and they know that if we don't have these conversations, if we don't figure out the evidence, if we don't figure out how to change some of the administrative ways that we pay for things, then we won't get to the access. And then that serves no one. So I feel optimistic that there are efforts underway, as really saying a lot of them at the state level, where people are trying to think through, okay, this is how we've done it before. We've done fee for service, we've paid transactionally, we've had these kinds of discussions, but we have to think about something new, and I feel hopeful about that.
Julie, I don't know, again, you heard earlier from 3 biopharma companies I think are very progressive and engaging, and models for patient engagement. Ultragenics is another. I mean, what are you seeing in terms of the engagement in policy, and has that changed over the last couple of years? And do you see sort of new exciting reasons to be optimistic about all of this change from a policy point of view?
Yeah, so my first answer to that question would be, everybody that's in this room, so everybody, is looking for patients and families, hope. They're looking for different and better ways to do things. I would say at a state policy level, the pandemic has really changed the way that I think policy is being looked at in some regards. So, there's just different. There's more opportunities, and there's more people that are wanting to be engaged. I feel like there's more patient groups. There's more trying to kind of get everybody together for those purposes.
So questions from the audience? We have time for a couple. Charlotte, I think.
Hi guys, this is super interesting. I think from my perspective, something that have been really curious about is the payer aspect of these really expensive, like kind of single administration treatments. And I was wondering if there's any precedent for, payers working to do some kind of system where if that happens, like if a payer does pay, $1 million, and then that person inevitably changes, because that happens every few years for a lot of people. Is there any precedent for doing something like a credit where, there's some kind of protection for payers, and that if somebody else inherits that patient who is now, having those cost savings realized, that, there's a different kind of transaction. I know it's really fragmented, might not be a simple answer, but I'm very curious.
No, there's great question, and there are a lot of ideas right now, and a few places that have tried some pilots. Massachusetts tried a few years ago. A bunch of insurance companies said, we will try if people move within this area that we could, continue on with some payments. It hasn't all panned out yet, and that's in part because these are just really different than how we've operated before. But there are a lot of different kind of things on the table. We do a lot of work looking at value-based payment contracting, and can you tie things to outcomes, and would payers be more perhaps interested in going into kind of those contracts with manufacturers, because they would say, we're not going to pay you up if you don't get the results, and everyone's kind of at risk. But it doesn't really get, the portability issue of patients is huge. And it's one that, is just the nature of our U.S. not having a national system. But I do think there's some payers who are trying to think that through. And hopefully we can see some innovation actually happen. I think there might be at the pilot level right now. CMS just recently put forth a response about a priority of outcomes-based contracts around cell and gene therapies. I don't know a lot of what that would look like, and whether it will be multi-state or between payers. But I think there's an interest in some kind of payers trying to do some things different.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? All right. Thank you so much. So as Marianne promised, we're going to be digging in more on cell and gene therapy. So up next, we've got Jeff Chamberlain and Shelley Egan. Jeff Chamberlain from UW to talk about cell and gene therapy, getting into a little bit of the science, but giving sort of the landscape and history. And then Shelley will be kind of taking again the journey of a cell and gene therapy from that early research all the way through to patients, and what are some of the buckets of challenges. We heard from some evidence generation, a little bit around cost, but really assessing the value of these treatments. So that's what's up next. And with that, Jeff.
Thank you, Josh. So my laboratory mainly works on the muscular dystrophies, trying to develop gene therapies. So what I thought I would do today is just give a general background on what is gene therapy, and then try to highlight, just very briefly how it's being applied to muscular dystrophy, and then focus on some of the limitations that have kind of slowed down further development of these methods. So first, what is gene therapy? What do we mean when we talk about that? At a very simple level, it just refers to using genes or genetic material as a drug, a form of medicine. There are a lot of different ways you can apply gene therapies. Not everybody agrees on the exact definition, but that's okay. But in general, it refers to methods to try to bring new genes into the body to replace defective genes, or to modify the structure or the activity of these genetic regions. There's a couple of different flavors of gene therapy, if you will. I'm going to just concentrate on probably the two most common ones. The major type of gene therapy is often referred to as gene replacement therapy. And what that refers to is a situation, most particularly when you have a rare disorder, or in many cases cancer, that are caused by defects in existing genes within your body. And the idea here is, if you can take a normal version of that gene and figure out a way to get it back into the critical or the important cell types or tissues in the body, you should be able to overcome the problems being caused by the defective gene and hopefully have an effective treatment. The other type of gene therapy that's really attracting a lot of attention lately is the newest form. It's very exciting. It's referred to as gene editing, sometimes called CRISPR. You may have heard about it. It's getting a lot of attention in the media. And CRISPR is a little different than gene replacement because rather than trying to bring in a new version of a gene, CRISPR or gene editing aims to actually try to go after a defective or a mutant gene and repair it, actually fix it and make it normal rather than bringing in a new gene. So a bit of a history. Gene therapy's been around kind of a while, at least relative probably to the age of all of us, or some of us anyway. It was originally conceived in about 1975, I think, was the first publication that proposed using genes as medicine. The first patient, the first human clinical trial was conducted at the National Institutes of Health in about 1990. But the first really clear success that this was working and having an impact on a patient wasn't until 2009. And only a couple of years ago, the Food and Drug Administration granted approval to the very first gene therapy that could be used as a prescription drug. And this was for a type of cancer, an immune type gene therapy where cells were manipulated using genetic modification to trigger these blood cells to attack particular types of cancer. I don't want to go into any detail on that. The first gene replacement therapy, if you will, which involved using a delivery shuttle or a vector to introduce a new gene into the body, was approved by the FDA in 2017 for a rare form of blindness. This is a drug known as Luxturna, which uses a delivery vehicle that we call AAV. And the AAV is a very common gene delivery vehicle that's currently in thousands of human clinical trials. More in the realm of neuromuscular diseases, which is a little closer to what I work on. The drug Zolgensma was approved by the FDA in 2020. This has had a major impact. There's already been thousands of patients treated with this gene therapy. It involves an intravascular or an IV infusion right into your bloodstream of one of these AAV delivery shuttles to replace a critical gene that's defective in causing this disease, spinal muscular atrophy. And as we heard from the previous speaker, there are thousands of ongoing gene therapy trials right now. I have a little graph here which sort of breaks it down. As we heard, almost a third of all gene therapies are focused on cancers, but there's many that are focused on more other non-cancer diseases such as muscular dystrophy, types of inherited blindness, cardiovascular diseases, things of that nature. So just to break it down a little bit, hopefully this isn't too simplistic, but when we talk about gene therapy, we're talking about DNA, the genetic material within all your cells. So every cell in the body, or essentially every cell in the body, has a nucleus, and the nucleus contains all the DNA that has the genetic code, the instructions to build out your body from embryonic development on up. The DNA is carried by chromosomes. Most of us have 46 chromosomes. Chromosomes are your genetic material packed down in proteins to compact it and make it fit inside these tiny cells. And if you look at the DNA that makes up the chromosomes, it's composed of a series of genes that are in a linear array along the chromosomes. And the genes are, of course, make up this double-stranded, double helical structure that was identified by Watson and Crick a little more than 50 years ago. It was the first identification of what a gene was. And most genes have the genetic code to make proteins. So proteins are the workhorses of the cell that do things, and mutations in genes often cause defective or absent production of particular proteins that are critical for certain cell types to work, and that's what leads to many, certainly all the inherited types of rare diseases. So, since the mutations in these genes can lead to inherited or in some cases acquired diseases, the idea of gene therapy is to go in and identify the gene that is not working properly and either replace it or fix it. That's the goal of gene therapy. So some of the more, even though we're talking about rare diseases, really all genetic diseases are relatively rare. Muscular dystrophy that I work on is thought to be one of the most common inherited diseases. It only affects about 1 in 7,000 newborn births. So even being a common genetic disease, that's rare in the grand scheme of things. If you think about it, 1 in 4 people are going to get cancer at some point or heart disease. Genetic diseases typically affect 1 in 10,000, 1 in 20,000 or less individuals. I've listed some of the more common genetic diseases on this list that are all major targets of gene therapy, including some heart diseases have a genetic component, and certainly cancer has a genetic component. The difference between cancer and most of the rare diseases that we're probably thinking about in this room is that with cancer, you often, you may be born with a defective gene, but with cancer, you typically have to have 2 or more genes become defective, and so often that second hit, if you will, is a second mutation that is acquired at some point in your lifetime that can lead to cancer. But there's a lot of approaches using a gene therapy to try to treat even acquired cancer. At the bottom of this slide here, it looks like it didn't format perfectly well, is sort of a very simplistic view of what a gene is. Genes are typically composed of several parts. There is a regulatory switch, or what we call an on-off switch, that has the instructions for when to turn on a gene. In other words, when to have that gene make a protein. You have the coding region of the gene that is typically a protein coding region, although it can sometimes encode RNA or ribonucleic acid. And then there's a small stop sign at the end of the gene that tells the cellular machinery that it has reached the end of the coding region for that gene. Now, I was referring to mostly gene replacement therapy. CRISPR, I mentioned, is the newest approach that really is thought to have a tremendous potential to revolutionize medicine. The difference, again, is that CRISPR is a method where you can go in and identify a specific region within a gene. Typically, that's going to be a mutant region of that gene or a defective part of that gene, and repair it rather than replace that gene, actually return it to a totally normal working function. So this is, you're actually changing the genetic code, usually to try to return it to a normal version rather than a defective version. And it's really being widely used in laboratories, and there's some clinical trials going on. There's tremendous use of this CRISPR method for basic biological research, but its main excitement is as a form of medicine to try to develop gene therapies. And sometimes people refer to it as sort of a molecular tweezers approach to go in and fix problems with the double helix of DNA. To give you an example of how important people feel this is, these 2 scientists here, Dr. Charpentier and Doudna, won the Nobel Prize in Medicine just a couple of years ago for discovering CRISPR. Their initial discovery came in 2012, which is only about 10 years ago. That's, if you follow Nobel Prizes, probably most of us don't, but that's incredibly rapid for a Nobel Prize. Usually Nobel Prizes come 30 or 40 or 50 years after a discovery, often when the discovering scientist is 80 years old or things like that. So to see a Nobel Prize come so quickly is usually rarely happens, only in the case of a massively important discovery, and certainly CRISPR is one of the most exciting discoveries in the last 20 years. We saw this a little bit a few minutes ago, what approved gene and cell therapies. This is from data from the American Society for Gene and Cell Therapy. There's only 20, at least as of January, there are only 24 gene therapies that have been approved in the United States. There's some additional therapies that focus more on RNA rather than DNA, and then about 60 approved cell therapies. So that's not a great number considering that there's more than 6,000 rare genetic diseases that are known right now. So very briefly, Duchenne muscular dystrophy is again, it's thought to be one of the most common inherited diseases. It's the most common form of muscular dystrophy. There's a lot of different types of muscular dystrophy, but there's about 300,000 patients worldwide with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. One of the reasons this is the most common or one of the most common inherited diseases is that the gene that is defective in Duchenne muscular dystrophy is the largest gene that's ever been identified. It's called the dystrophin gene. It's about 200 times bigger than a typical gene. So it's just a huge gene. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with it, and these things do go wrong with it. And we think that because it's caused by mutations in this gene, if we can fix that gene, we might have an impact on the disease. So there's many labs throughout the world working on this. A number of biotech and pharma companies have jumped in, are doing fantastic work. And there's two different approaches that are being tested. There's direct gene replacement, as I talked about earlier, to take a synthetic version of the gene and use it to replace the defective gene. And then there's a huge amount of work going on using this CRISPR gene editing method to try to treat the disease. So there are currently 6 companies doing gene replacement therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy in ongoing clinical trials. The CRISPR gene repair methods have not yet entered the clinic, but they're well on the way to coming online. The problem with CRISPR, it's still a bit in its infancy. There's some safety and efficiency issues that need to be resolved before it can be applied to solid organ diseases like muscle. So what are the challenges? This is a fairly simplistic approach. We don't have a lot of time. Happy to answer more questions. But why are there so few gene therapies available? Well, one reason is that it's a relatively new form of medicine. It's still in its infancy. You might say, well, 50 years is not all that new. But the problem is the knowledge of that DNA is the genetic element hasn't been around that long. So we're still learning a lot. There's a tremendous limitation in the tools that we have and the techniques that we need to identify the appropriate genes and replace them in the body. And so these tools are still emerging. They're being refined and adapted. And what is the limitation on development of these tools? I would say at a fairly simple level, the main limitations are money and people to do the work. So I'm going to go into that a little bit. So we can sort of break down the development of new therapies in 2 phases. Most of the early basic discoveries happen in university research labs at a very small scale. Once those discoveries are made and they're starting to show promise, they'll typically be picked up by a biotech company or a pharma company that can devote enormously greater resources and energy into taking those discoveries into the clinic. Why is it a breakdown? Part of it is that a lot of the basic discoveries that we need to even figure out how to develop new therapies like this are very risky. Most of the things that are tested don't work out. That's where university labs are quite useful. They can focus on really basic issues that may or may not lead to a treatment. They can take a lot of risks, unlike some of the pharma companies that are public companies and typically have to focus a little more on the bottom line. But nonetheless, there's an ongoing back and forth between these 2 groups. So the question then becomes, well, who pays for all this research and who actually does that work? The research, these are rough estimates, but most of the basic research that leads to medical discoveries is paid for by the federal government through the National Institutes of Health. Some of it comes from state governments, but not really that much. I'd say about 80% of basic research funding, medical research funding, comes from the NIH to university labs. The rest of it comes from charitable foundations, many patient advocacy groups, parent-developed foundations, families, donors, things like that contribute a little bit. The problem is that in the past, we've seen tremendous interest in Congress in funding basic research. That's not the case necessarily anymore. It's been flat for the last 20 years. Basic research funding by the federal government through the National Institutes of Health has been flat for over 20 years. It has not kept up with inflation. State support is minimal. Even here in the state of Washington, we have fabulous universities. The University of Washington is one of the top research universities in the entire world. Our funding has been declining. The support from the state of Washington to the University of Washington has been dropping for the last 20 years, certainly not keeping up with inflation. In any case, there's almost no state money going to medical research. So that's an area that we could perhaps advocate for at a local level. So my slides got out of order here. This was actually back to dystrophin replacement. This is a comparison of the gene editing versus the gene replacement approaches for muscular dystrophy, just showing what I was intended to show here on this green. These green staining is this missing protein that can be replaced either with gene replacement on the right or with the gene editing on the left, although the gene replacement is currently a little more efficient, but that may not always be the case. This is again, these slides are going backwards here. This is what we see in normal muscle. This white ring around these individual muscle cells is this protein that in Duchenne muscular dystrophy is completely missing. So that's the goal there, is to try to repeat that, to replace that. So I think this is my final slide. So the challenge is where do we go from basic research into clinical trials and cures? That's where this partnership between basic research labs and biotech and pharma comes into place. As I mentioned, the amount of money in university labs to do research is quite limited. We can do the basic studies in tissue culture plates, in yeast, in bacteria, and sometimes in rodents and things like that. But once something shows promise, to really scale that up and do research and support clinical trials costs so much money, often billions of dollars, to really get a new drug approved. That's vastly exceeds the amount of money available to basic researchers at universities, and that's where these companies have to come in, raising money, and eventually, hopefully having products that they can sell and gain more money to do further research. So again, not a lot of this formal drug development of going into getting an approved drug to sell on the market is done at universities. It's too expensive, it's too specialized, but universities do often collaborate with pharmaceutical companies to do the clinical trials at their hospitals and things like that. So what are there solutions? I don't know what the ideal solution is, other than I'd say we really need a significant increase in funding at all stages of drug development. One thing in particular is, what is the cost of research? A lot of the cost of research is to pay the scientists that are doing those studies, and it's not just scientists like myself. A lot of the hardcore work done at the lab bench is done by students, undergraduates, graduate students, postdoctoral students. There's a whole range of people that are critical for the infrastructure and basic research labs. They have to be paid. They need to, eat and pay their bills and all that. The reagents, the equipment used in a lab is incredibly expensive. We really need more funding, because with more funding, we can recruit more people, hopefully get them excited about science and keep them there. And that's the one thing that's going to speed up the basic discoveries to get there. The other thing is we need incentives, and we need to make science popular again. One of the things, unfortunately, I think that's come out of the COVID crisis that we went through is that a lot of people have started challenging science and saying that, science is bad, science can be evil. It used to be bipartisan. The most popular thing in Congress was to fund medical research through the National Institutes of Health. I think those days are behind us, and I'm sorry that that's the case, but it's going to have a significant impact on future cures if we can't return some credibility to the scientific community. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate having your perspective on sort of the early basic research side. We'll have you around for questions in a minute. But to your point about the handoff and the partnership with pharma, I wanted to invite up Shelley Egan, who's in medical affairs at Pfizer, for the next talk.
All right, thank you. So before I get started, I just wanted to share with everybody a little bit about why I'm here. So as Joshua mentioned, I'm with U.S. Medical Affairs with Rare Disease Neurology for Pfizer. And I am a pediatric nurse practitioner by training. I have always had a strong passion in caring for kids that have rare degenerative neuromuscular disorders, such as various types of muscular dystrophy that Dr. Chamberlain had mentioned. I was given an incredible gift by one of my former patients who has one of these rare diseases. And her and her mother had given me this, and it's kind of a reminder for me every day. So on the back is her photo and a little memento of something that her mom had written for me. On the front is a quote by Walt Disney that says, "It's kind of fun to do the impossible." I keep this on my desk kind of as a daily reminder that sometimes it's really fun to do the impossible like Walt Disney did. It was not long ago that gene therapy was believed to be impossible, but we're actually seeing that come to fruition now for many families and patients that have these rare conditions. So here today, I want to start the discussion about considerations related to gene therapy within the rare neuromuscular disease population. As mentioned previously, There's a large number of cell and gene therapy approvals anticipated in the near future. It's estimated to be about 30 to 60 approvals probably by 2030, and this could reach up to 350,000 patients. So obviously a big impact there. Given the anticipated number of patients that could be impacted by the cell and gene therapies, it's necessary for our healthcare system to continue to evolve as more treatments become available. And we'll kind of touch on each of these areas as we go through this here. First and foremost, let's talk about treating the correct patient. So we start with all patients that have a specific genetic disease or condition. From there, with a lot of the treatments that are available right now, it uses an AAV vector, like Dr. Chamberlain talked about. If it is that particular vector, there are certain patients that have been previously exposed to that vector who have developed neutralizing antibodies, which therefore makes them ineligible for treatments currently. Some of the other factors that could impact a patient's eligibility include the advancement of their disease, possibly their age, and other comorbidities that are related to their underlying disorder. We're then left with this smaller amount of patients with that specific condition who are actually eligible for the treatment. Once the patients have been identified and treated, it is important for us to continue to get real-world evidence as well as long-term data. Patients, when they're in clinical trials, they follow kind of a sort of a recipe of sorts. So there's a protocol that's followed. There's certain information that's collected each time they come to the visits. However, once we're in the real world and we're out of those clinical trials, we don't have those recipes. Then it becomes part of the institution or the clinic's responsibility to help gather that data. There are a significant amount of costs and responsibility with collecting that data, as well as keeping up with the registries for patients and the data out there. It can also be very difficult and time-consuming to get that data, and there's somewhat of a lack of incentive for follow-up for patients and providers. I think all of us probably know somebody who maybe has a condition where they're feeling really good, so they're like, oh, maybe I don't need to necessarily go to that appointment next week. Let's go. I mean, we've got Mother's Day coming up, we've got Memorial Day coming up, let's go on this trip instead. And sometimes those appointments are not always rescheduled. So making sure that we get that data to support what we've seen in clinical trials. Another challenge is the assessment of the value of gene therapy, and this was also brought up earlier. So rare diseases obviously have a smaller number of patients than some of the more common diseases, and not all of them have a standard of care. Gene therapies, as we know, currently have a very high cost, which also had been brought up earlier, and we've seen this within the hemophilia and the spinal muscular atrophy realm. Current health technology assessments are not able to capture the full values of the improved quality of life or the decrease in the caregiver burden, also brought up earlier. So I had a young lady that told me after starting a different kind of treatment for her spinal muscular atrophy that she was able to hold a bar of soap. She hadn't been able to do that for years. That was something that was really impactful for her. I had another young boy that told me he was able to open a pop can. Also hadn't done that for years. Although that improved their quality of life, that didn't necessarily equate to those standardized tests that the insurance companies are looking for. So the value is more hypothetical and looking at long term. If you have a patient, for example, that has asthma, and that patient starts having an asthma attack, they can take the rescue inhaler and start to have an improvement in symptoms. For patients that receive a gene therapy or have a rare disease, you may not see that immediate impact like we do for asthma. Next, we'll move on to the challenges related to manufacturing and the supply of gene therapy. So this isn't just a pill that we can stamp and put in a bottle. I mean, it's really important that all of the viral vectors are exactly the same. The transgenes are exactly the same. We want the patients to get everything exact for each patient. So the manufacturing there's a lot more that goes into that for gene therapy. Companies need to be ready to go once there's an approval. So there's scaling up challenges to get from the clinical trials to the actual production and administration to patients. There's also right now for gene therapy, everything is required to be stored at very cold temperatures. So looking at storage itself and then how to maintain those very cold temperatures when we're transporting that particular treatment or therapy. Prior to medication approval, it's necessary to navigate pathways for site readiness so that we can avoid delays in treatment once the eligible patients are identified. Site readiness, I kind of compare to looking at getting ready for a play. So you have to try and get the right people together to be able to do this performance or perform this treatment. And then you have to be able to work out all the kinks, figure out where is this production going to take place? Who all needs to be involved and at what times do they need to be involved? And then doing some run-throughs prior to actually having the first infusion or first treatment for these patients. I personally was involved in this on a couple of occasions, specifically for spinal muscular atrophy when treatments became available for that. And we had meetings for months, several times a week, before the drug was even approved or even thought to be approved. And then for months afterwards to make sure that we were ready to actually start administering that treatment. Some key considerations for site preparedness include making sure that you have a plan for the receiving, the handling, and the storage of the product once you get it, again, because of those very cold temperatures. Transporting within the facility, who's going to be in charge of making sure to get that to the pharmacy, drawing it up? What's the education that needs to be provided to be able to draw that up safely and then administer it safely. And then as well as the education for disposal of waste, because there's certain requirements there. And then lastly, but perhaps most importantly, is the engagement with the patient community and groups like the Coalition for Successful Drug Development. There's a lot of variability from state to state that's been mentioned today on coverage, administration, how and where it's going to be delivered. What it's going to look like here in Washington is different from Montana, where I live, or Wisconsin, where I grew up, or New York City. So all of those look different. And together, there's an opportunity for the development of treatments for many patients with rare diseases. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to invite you to stick around for questions and invite Jeff back up. We did ask for this. We did ask for this focus for this session to be around challenges around bringing medicines to market. But I want to keep going with this theme of, all right, in light of all of these challenges, what are the reasons, what are you feeling most optimistic about as you look to the future of gene therapy, either on the research side or beyond?
Well, on the research side, the progress is accelerating. That's the good news. 20 years ago, there were all these challenges to gene therapy. It was a great idea, but it had never worked in the clinic. And there are reasons that it wasn't working well. And, those reasons are being uncovered. It's leading to new discoveries, new developments. You talked about improvements with these AAV vectors, with manufacturing technologies. These things are falling into place, and we're having more and more trials. We're learning more. We're making improvements in terms of making these therapies last longer, be more effective, and things like that. So I think we've really, over the last 5 years in particular, have kind of broken through this critical level where things are actually starting to work. And now we need to pay attention to the lessons that are being learned, apply them more broadly to additional diseases, and really try to scale them up and get them into the marketplace.
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree, and I feel like, as Dr. Chamberlain mentioned, we've come a long way since gene therapy started back in the 1990s. There's been some very unfortunate missteps, but there's been some great successes, and I think that the Zolgensma is the one that I've worked most personally with, is a great example of that. And while we may not quite be at a cure yet for these gene therapies, we are in an era of really accelerating the treatment. And you're going to hear a lot more about gene therapies over the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
Thanks for the great presentations. So Dr. Chamberlain, you mentioned that in the US, the funding for basic research hasn't really been increasing recently in the past 20 years. How does kind of the landscape here in the US compare to other developed countries? And yeah, would you say that the US is kind of getting behind in some of these areas because of the lack of funding?
Well, I wouldn't say that we're necessarily falling behind. You know, not to be too much of a homer or anything, but I think the U.S. is still by far leading the world in terms of the development of new therapies and new medicine and basic research in general. Some of the problems we're having with funding are happening across the world, unfortunately. So, you know, there's tremendous research infrastructure in England, France, Italy, mostly a lot of Western European countries. They're falling on harder times also. The one possible exception is China. China is massively increasing their research spending. They're churning out 50 times more PhDs per year than is happening in the United States, and they are on a fast track to try to catch up with us. And you know, depending on your point of view, that's either good or bad. The good news is that somebody's putting a huge amount of money into research and infrastructure and making a lot of progress. The drawback is that you know, in China they don't necessarily hold their research and product development to the same standards that we do here in the United States. And there's some political tensions between the countries, obviously, and all that. But there's starting to be a lot of really fantastic research coming out of China.
Thanks. Time for one more question.
You mentioned the state funding has gone down. How can we motivate them to want to fund that more? Because we do have amazing research universities here. And so how can we help you get them funding that you need?
Well, I'm probably not an expert on that particular question. I don't know. You know, we've got fabulous research infrastructure here at the University of Washington. Like I say, you know, not to brag about our local institution, but it is one of the premier research institutions in the entire world. I think the University of Washington has more research dollars from the National Institutes of Health than any other institution in the United States. But it's not enough, and it's been dropping. And it's difficult to encourage and motivate, particularly younger scientists, to stay in this field, to come into this field. You know, we're not getting nearly the applicants to do medical research that we got 20 years ago. A lot of kids today, they say, this, you know, I can't even live in Seattle on the salaries that the University of Washington is paying. They're going to business school, they're going to law school, medical school, things like that. So we, you know, how do you persuade the state of Washington to put more money into research? I don't know. You know, there's a lot of competing issues, a lot of areas that need more money, but you know, all I can say is you can make the argument that we're really on the cusp of a revolution in medicine through genetics, and we've got one of the premier institutions in the world. Why not support it? One of the issues is, you know, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding that a lot of people have about what universities do. And I'll give you an example. You know, when I meet people all the time and they say, "What do you do?" I say, "I'm a professor at the University of Washington." And they go, "What classes do you teach?" And I go, "Well, you know, I run a major research laboratory employing dozens of people. We're trying to cure diseases. I don't teach introductory English, but I do teach people in my lab. We have undergraduates, I have graduate students working on their PhDs, I have postdoctoral scientists that I work with and teach one-on-one in the laboratory. A lot of people think, well, that's a waste of time. That's not what university is supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be teaching English or history or things like that. But, you know, as I tried to emphasize in my talk, universities, particularly research universities like the University of Michigan or University of Washington, sorry, I used to be at the University of Michigan. It's a great university also. These are the driving forces of all the basic discoveries that 20, 30 years down the road lead to new medicines. And most people don't understand that. And maybe our legislators don't understand that either. I don't know. But, yeah.
And second part of our last question.
When there's gene therapy being done outside of the United States, how does that, I guess I'm not really sure how I should form this question. When you're aware of gene therapy and that's successful, but they do it outside of the United States because the United States and the FDA just doesn't get it together. I don't know. But how does that information, do you guys use that information that you find out from the outside countries that gene therapy's been done and they're like, wait a minute, why can't we do this here? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, I would say, all the ongoing gene therapy trials and the basic research worldwide is shared quite extensively. You don't have a lot of secrets in this area. Sometimes people will hang on to things until they can go public and publish an article describing what they did. But beyond that, if you keep it to yourself and don't share it with everybody else, it goes nowhere. You're not going to get credit for what you're doing. You're not going to be able to expand what you're doing and things like that. So certainly at the basic and translational research level, everything is shared pretty openly, I would say. And even at maybe you should speak on this, but even with the companies, a lot of the clinical trials that go on are going on at many sites throughout the world. I mean, I don't want to speak for Pfizer, but Pfizer runs clinical trials all over the world, right? So it's a much more sharing, open community than perhaps a lot of other areas are.
Great, so we'll wrap up there. Thank you both so much. So we've got one more session in this final block, so I'd like to invite up my colleague Max Brown, another co-founder of the Northwest Rare Disease Coalition, Mark Cummings, and Katie Stoll for a discussion about policy solutions.
Thanks, Joshua. Appreciate the time here. My name is Max Brown with the Desmond Consulting Group. I have the great privilege and honor of helping to steer the policy and advocacy work that goes on. Come on out here, Katie. With the coalition. And first, just want to say a huge thank you. I know and see many of the advocates around this room who showed up in person in Olympia this last year, took time out of busy lives, with their families to testify remotely to make an impact in Olympia. First and foremost, thank you. That work is so important. And we'll talk a little bit about some important policy issues here, but I want to just keep encouraging you to show up and help to educate lawmakers. I think something that we've learned through these discussions is that connecting the dots between the next generation of diagnostics, therapeutics, and patients is going to require policymakers to understand the impacts on patients in the community. That work doesn't happen unless you're showing up. So I know many people already are, but I want to kind of kick that off in that way. So without further ado, let's jump in here. First, I'll give Mark and Katie a couple minutes apiece to introduce themselves. Mark is the CEO and president of Life Science Washington, which is our state's Biotech chapter. And then Katie is the executive director of the Genetic Support Foundation, and she herself is a genetic counselor by trade. So let's do just a couple minutes of introductions. Maybe, Mark, do you want to kick us off, and we'll go over to Katie.
Sure. Thanks, Max. A little loud. Mark Cummings, Life Science Washington, President and CEO. We're the statewide association, as Max pointed out. So biotech, medical device, medical research, those are all members of ours and work on those, both the policy issues, convening that community, big focus on training and workforce issues, as you just heard, challenge bringing folks into the field. Just on personal note, before being CEO, was head of policy for the organization, spent first half of my career back in DC working on innovation policy issues, and was out here for the last 20 or so years, both here and then at Battelle and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory before that.
Thanks so much. I'm a genetic counselor, also executive director at Genetic Support Foundation, which is a nonprofit that's seeking to increase access to independent genetic counseling services, and also develops educational tools and resources about genetics and health. A big focus of our work is just trying to bring genetic counseling to places that don't have access. So we do provide a lot of genetic counseling services through telehealth, but also really advocating for some sustainable reimbursement model for genetic counseling, which right now doesn't exist and is really, I I think complicates this bigger picture, I think, sometimes more than we recognize. So thanks for inviting me to be a part of this discussion.
Great. That's a really helpful introduction here, Katie. And a lot of the conversations that we've had necessarily revolve around cost and access. And I think that is sort of centered on how do we resource the next generation of diagnostics, the professionals that support patients and understanding how to use that information for therapeutics. And I think we saw the slides earlier. I believe Dr. Hamilton was presenting and some others. There's a lot of cell and gene therapies and other things in the medical pipeline, right? So you're going to have in the next 3 to 5 years more of these things being approved. FDA is going to be sort of pitching them out, trying to get them to patients. But if we don't have systems in place locally for insurance companies or Medicaid or Medicare to reimburse for those things, how do patients get access? So actually the first question I really have for you is about risk and cost. Like, what happens if we don't solve these policy challenges, and what are going to be the implications for patients and or innovators who are trying to bring us the next generation? Maybe Katie, actually, can I start back with you on this question?
I mean, I guess what we've been hearing, I think the cost of not addressing some of these challenges are that patients aren't going to have access to these new therapies and are going to be burdened by the issues that could be hopefully solved by some of these therapies. I mean, I think I don't know if you want to pick.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's an interesting time. So you just went through, a couple last speakers. I mean, on the science side, I mean, things are progressing at, really incredible. On one hand, built on, several decades of foundational work, but really moving quite quickly today. I think the challenge is, and this isn't unique to rare disease, but I think, on the political side, we've gone through several election cycles where, one of the top 2 or 3 messages is drugs cost too much, period. Right? And so there's a huge challenge there that we haven't differentiated between innovative new drugs. Drugs are expensive because they're addressing a small, patient population, versus a drug that's 20, 30 years old and just still costs a bunch, right? And I think so that, that's on all of us, not just in the rare disease space, but in general, to help educate, policymakers. And as you heard from previous folks, state legislature. I mean, when I went down to testify, you look up at the committee, and several of those folks, were either selling insurance or were realtors, 2 months ago, and now they're trying to figure out, how do you bring a drug to market? It's not something that's sort of intuitive for many folks, and so helping folks understand sort of what that journey looks like, right? So it's 10 to 15 years of foundational research, a couple $1 billion to bring a drug to market. And then as we've talked about, I mean, it's not easier to bring a drug to market for a large population versus a rare population, right? I mean, you still got to do the research, you still got to do the clinical trials, you still got to go through all those steps. And so I think, anything that you can do to sort of help educate on that front. And I think as we get into, and we've done this a couple of times, we went down, you talked about on cell and gene therapy, just wanted to have an open conversation with the legislature and sort of, what it's going to look like to look at reimbursement and how we're going to sort of pay for sort of next generational tools. And, sort of our healthcare authority said, oh, that's great. We'll take it from here. And the reality was they were scared to death. The numbers you kind of reference, when they look at those 2,000 clinical trials that are in the queue for therapies and they see things that are 6 figures, right? They're not differentiating between something that affects thousands of people versus something that affects millions of people, right? And so you've got to provide that context for folks. So I think it's going to be interesting. Obviously, the first massive sort of drug pricing legislation passed this year at the federal level. Hopefully that sort of will open up some space with that behind us to have some of these conversations around, now with that sort of addressed, what do we have to do to bring this next generation of therapies to market? Because, I mean, unabashedly, they're going to be expensive. You just simply can't do, development for a small patient population and pick it up for $25 copay at CVS, right? I mean, it's going to be expensive, and we need to articulate that and help people understand why that is and what the process is to develop a drug for a small patient population and how challenging it is. And then, we can get into sort of, the difference in small molecule, but doing, as we talked about the last couple of selling gene therapies and challenges on reimbursement stuff. We can talk about that later.
Yeah, no, and this reimbursement question, I think, is sort of at the heart of what's next, right, in terms of new medical innovation. So I guess the next question really is just to understand, both of you serve different constituencies, different groups that are working with patients in different ways. How do you see this reimbursement question either helping you get more services to patients or inhibiting, kind of the way in which patients are able to access either diagnosis or therapeutics? And Katie, why don't you start with us?
Yes. So I can kind of back up to the diagnostic piece and this getting access to the diagnostics, which is, I think, where genetic counselors are often playing a role in this area. So genetic testing, molecular diagnostics are expensive, and there are many reasons for that, but compared to other lab medicine, genetic tests cost quite a bit. So there are a lot of barriers in place to even accessing those diagnostics to begin with, because they cost more than other labs. Insurance companies often put up a lot of barriers to coverage for testing, and a lot of payer policies don't keep up with just new developments in the realm of genetic testing. So there's a lag in just the payer policies keeping up with these new developments that can really be important for patients. I see that genetic counselors, in addition to many other things, one of the roles that we wear, and I think more and more, is really advocating for patients to access molecular diagnostics and including genetic testing. And I tell patients a lot, we're good at jumping through hoops, but we spend a lot of time jumping through hoops right now. It's to get a test covered, looking at working through pre-authorization and letters of medical necessities and appeals just to get the testing done in the first place. Sometimes that's not successful, and genetic counselors are looking to other ways to get testing covered for patients through, through nonprofits, through sponsored testing through pharmaceutical companies. So genetic counselors are often the ones that are navigating all of that. But even a step back from that, genetic counseling itself isn't reimbursed well. So the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, CMS, does not recognize genetic counselors as providers that will be covered for services. And many private insurance companies, commercial insurance companies, follow Medicare on what will be covered. A lot of state Medicaid programs cover Medicare on what will be covered. Washington State actually has had policy in place to cover genetic counseling in some instances for many years. But there is a formula that sets what the reimbursement is for genetic counseling in Washington State, and it varies a little bit from year to year based on this funding formula, which I understand has to be budget neutral from year to year for Medicaid services. So just to give an idea, genetic counseling time is reimbursed this year by Medicaid at $28.50 for up to a 45-minute face-to-face time. So if you're seeing a patient with a rare disease and you're helping to prepare to meet with that patient and that family, and then all of the research and time and follow-up, all of the advocating for pre-authorization for genetic testing and appeals and everything like that, you might be spending 8 or 10 or 12 or more hours just trying to help that one patient with that initial visit, but you might only be paid that $28.50 for that 45-minute face-to-face time that you have with a patient. And when I say the genetic counselors paid that, that's what the institution would be reimbursed for that time, right? So it's difficult, I think, for hospitals and clinics to employ genetic counselors to do this work because it's not reimbursed for what we do. So I think that genetic counselors are a pretty key piece to the diagnostic journey that we have a real problem with reimbursement right now.
Appreciate those comments. And Mark, on the therapeutic access side, we've seen more and more kind of price setting, price control policies locally, federally. How does that kind of play out when it comes to this pipeline of development that we're talking about?
Yeah, and I put maybe just one bright spot is you put that in the context of 20 years, right? I mean, our diagnostics and things are much cheaper than they were 20, 30 years ago, right? So I mean, we continue to make progress on that front. But I think as you move in your comments, then also on the therapeutic side, I mean, it's like, again, as we think about I think about these as sort of the next generation of therapies, right? I mean, so things that are not traditional small molecule therapies, in most cases, not always, but in many. And I mean, I think we have to sort of carve out a spot. So, thanks to Caroline and folks for putting together the Rare Disease Coalition, and then I think hopefully with some luck we'll pass the advisory committee bill next year. But we've got to create some space to have those conversations on how are you going to both develop, deliver, that whole continuum from the university research to the clinical trials to the development to the market, and then the issues you're getting into is actual access and sort of on the day-to-day side. And I just think as that changes, right, you can't come into legislators and others with sort of pay more for this, carve this out, one at a time. They're all just viewed as sort of a standalone cost issue. And literally, that's how legislators look at it, is they just go, oh, what's the cost? And you got to put that in the context of sort of what does that mean for patients? What does it mean for care? Where's that continuum? How does that work? And I think we've got to move that whole conversation holistically, which is as we have these new, very different types of therapies and more personalized therapies, right? What does that continuum look like? Because people have a notion of sort of, if they were legislators and they've done this 15 years ago and they remember their copay was, like, oh, well, this is more than that. And you've got to go back and have that broader conversation to put those costs in context, as opposed to, sort of just biting each one of those off by themselves, in which case, it sort of just becomes a food fight between, who's paying and who's receiving.
That's a good point, too. And our legislators, sort of by dint of our Constitution, right, are required to balance the budget every 2 years. And some of the curative impacts, I think we've heard other speakers talk about, the timeline on those might be much longer, right? So how do we kind of square the circle? I think it's going to be an important conversation moving forward.
Well, and Max, that's a good example. We talked, I think Pfizer was alluding to that, as you think about these, as the price tags are bigger, you've got to think about new ways, sort of value-based contracts and others that spread that cost. Because I may not have this right, but I think I remember that, from an insurer standpoint, people move about every 18 months, right? And so, they're thinking about, a multi-$100,000 or $1 million, therapy. That's just a series of conversations that we've got to work out. And I don't think everybody's got a good answer, because on the industry side, some are willing to, do it at risk, some aren't. Some are willing to spread payments over time. Some, do those in installments. So all those kind of things need to be sort of thought through so that there can be sort of new models put in front of folks. And again, I think we need to create some space for those conversations, because there's not a clear one-size-fits-all, solution right now. We got to just work through those.
See, now here I thought you would have the solution. So something we need to keep working on together. Okay, last question then. Even as we get through cost reimbursement conversations, there might be other structural barriers that remain for patients to access care in Washington State. What are some of the other conversations that are kind of perking up for you, Katie, when it comes to other barriers that patients are facing to access genetic counseling?
I think location, reaching communities that are outside of big urban centers, genetic conditions, rare diseases that are affecting people all over the state, and areas where it might not be so easy to access specialty services. So I think, increasing access to telemedicine is huge.
Mark, your reflection on the same question.
Again, Max?
Oh, sorry. Other barriers, sort of structural barriers that you see facing patients in Washington that aren't necessarily related to reimbursement and cost, but are still impactful that we should kind of think about from a policy perspective.
Yeah, the one I jotted down was, I sort of alluded to this earlier, was I think we need to help. So as your point earlier on that a lot of these things end up having to be budget neutral, is really getting better about helping articulate the size of patient population for some of these, particularly in rare and ultra rare areas, where I just don't think a lot of folks, they see the price tag, they don't see what that means in terms of total cost. And I think if we could do a better job of that, it allows people to think differently around what those price tags are. Because I think, as I mentioned, they just see a generation of expensive drugs, as opposed to a new generation of sort of more personalized and targeted therapies.
Okay. So I think we'll just open up the floor here. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask our distinguished panelists, this would be the good time. Yeah.
Or if they just want to eat.
Yeah, I know, right. The hazard of the pre-lunch session. Thanks, Joshua.
I'm going to make this really long. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, Katie, with genetics, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for coming and presenting that portion, because that's been our experience as well, is that I had a genetic counselor who spent an entire year trying to get our middle son genetic testing after both of his siblings had been diagnosed with a rare terminal disease to say it's okay for him to move on with his life. It's okay that you are now not a carrier and no, you don't have CLN2 Batten's disease. But it took her an entire year and she worked through it. Although she only spent 45 minutes with me at the beginning and then called me to make a phone call. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Along the lines of reimbursement, insurance coding, as a genetic counselor, do you think care coordination could get pushed as an insurance code that maybe could fall under genetic counseling so you could get more reimbursement? Because that's basically what you're telling me you're doing from the get for our families, is a care coordination.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I don't know how possible that is, but I think that's a great idea. It'd be great to be able to have some manner of getting reimbursed for that non-face-to-face patient time, because there's a lot. I think most genetic counselors spend more time behind the scenes than direct face-to-face with patients.
There are other models too, like community health worker type models that aren't direct fee-for-service, but kind of take a look at the value over time. That might be an interesting template to look at.
How do families and patient advocacy groups get involved on a policy level that's accessible to them, that will also be impactful for the work that you're all doing?
Well, first things first, if you sign up, the northwestrare.org website has a fast email sign up. You can get on our list to make sure that you're kind of in the lane of communications as we get closer to session resuming in January. We'll have just a whole menu of options, whether you want to be remote or in person or somewhere in between. We can accommodate that from the coalition side, certainly. But other thoughts about ways to get active? Okay. There is a couple of storytelling booths out in the sort of booth area out here too. I'd encourage you to swing by. An important thing that we can do to educate lawmakers, just make sure they understand what rare patients are going through every day. That helps them sort of build support for some of these larger policy initiatives. So I'd encourage you to visit any and all of the storytelling booths that you see and share just a couple minutes. We can use that to great effect. Yes. Yes, and there is a virtual policy 101 session. I'll be leading with my colleague Emma Scalzo, who does our kind of alliance development work, just to kind of get you familiar with the inhale and exhale of advocacy in and around Olympia, federal, and beyond. Okay, you can see everybody's blood sugar dropping, so I think now is a good time to make the transition.
No, everybody please. That was a great panel. No, thank you guys so much. I know, everybody's really hungry, so I'm gonna make this really quick. First, I just, I love the ideas are just kind of going bling, 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 bling happening, like as we're having these conversations, and that's why we need to have these conversations. And so I just think these conversations are so important. So thank you so much for all the leaders and for all your hard work, speakers, and Max for moderating. We just need to have these conversations. And as far as policy, everybody could really get involved in policy. I mean, the patients make it real, but we need genetic counselors and, to talk about, and other researchers to talk about the numbers, the economic impact, how it saves lives. So really, it is all of us that can do policy and be part of this. So, and so we will continue, and if you want to be part of a task force, again, just contact Max, Joshua, or myself, and the coalition. And we always have a lot of projects going on, and so you are, always welcome to that. And again, just thank you to our speakers. A lunch will be upstairs. I don't know if you guys, I'm kind of turned around. So if you go out this way, and the elevators, it's on the second floor. And I will say that there's some, Every Life Foundation has rare artists. So you'll see some rare art printed, and then the stories are in the back for your entertainment there. And you'll also get to hear, again, more music from kids that written some songs for you during the break, I think, at least. And so we'll resume again at 2 p.m. So we'll be back here at 2 p.m. And then make sure to look at Malachi's artwork as you're passing to get to lunch. So excited to have his work here. And then I want to quickly just thank our sponsors again, because we couldn't do this without you. So we just appreciate your kindness and support. Seattle Children's Research Institute, Pfizer, Pharma, Illumina, Vertex, Ultragenics, Alexion, Mazi Therapeutics, Regeneron, Decimon Consulting Group, Born Here Research Foundation, and the Northwest Rare Disease Coalition. And again, as Max said, there is a booth called Stories Are X, and they're to get some of those stories and recorded, if you could be there for that. I think we'll see you again in a little bit. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you all for